Blockchain Chatter, presented by Tier 1 People, leaders in FinTech executive search. I'm your host, Dexter Cousins. Welcome to Blockchain Chatter, my new show where blockchain leaders join me for a chat. It seems a little crazy to start a blockchain podcast the week after the FTX collapse. So why have I done it? Well, I think there's never been a more important time to provide a platform for the builders in this space. Too much attention and focus has been given to crypto influencers and noisemakers. So Blockchain Chatter aims to cut through the noise and give outstanding leaders the opportunity to talk about their business, the big problem they solve, and how blockchain and emerging technology can become the operating system of a fairer, safer, and more efficient world. To kick off the show, I couldn't think of a better person who embodies the spirit of what this is all about. Today's guest is Chloe White, the CEO of Genesis Block. Chloe is Blockchain Leader of the Year and has worked directly on blockchain policy since 2018. Chloe's going to join me today to talk about the current state of the industry following last week's collapse of FTX, and more importantly, how we can regroup and what the future holds. Chloe, good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Is it a dream of mine that we were in Singapore 9 days ago recording blockchain news and were so optimistic and buoyant and energized by what this industry was about?
The emotional whiplash is real. It feels like a bad dream that I just wish I could wake up from. But every day, we get more news about what exactly has happened with FTX and Alameda. So we'll have to wait and see how the full story unfolds. But it's been a very difficult week for the community.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think both you and I want to say if there's anybody out there who's having a tough time and they need somebody to speak to and they want to reach out, look, I think not just you and I, but there's plenty of others in this space who want to try and help as much as we can. And, I think it is a time for solidarity, and our thoughts go out to anybody who's been impacted in this.
Yeah, absolutely. There have been a lot of financial losses in the community and also a lot of emotional pain. The community is going through some grief at the moment, and it's going to take a little bit of time for that to clear through the system. And so it's really important to reach out for support.
Yeah. Well, look, I guess, it would be great to have a chat with you just about your thoughts on what has happened with FTX and Alameda. And then look, we'll kind of talk through, I guess, where we go from here a little bit later. But there's been a lot of explanations out there. What kind of, how would you explain it? What have you found out about what's kind of transpired over this last 6 months or so?
So it seems to be the case that Sam Bankman-Fried was a deeply fraudulent person and has really done quite poorly by the community and particularly by his investors and customers. Clearly, there has been some mixing of the balance sheet of his exchange FTX and his trading fund Alameda. It's a little bit unclear exactly all of the details of how he was able to perpetuate this fraud and over what period of time. But at the moment, it looks like it's going to take quite some time for customers to get any assets back, given that there are now Chapter 11 proceedings undertaken in the US. And in the case of FTX Australia, receivers have been appointed for that entity. So I suppose that, this week's news has come as quite a shock to people. This is not the first time that we've seen a centralized exchange fail or rug pull. There have been incidents of this in Australia and internationally, and the community has known that this is a risk with centralized exchanges for a long time. I think what has taken people by surprise this week has been the speed and scale at which FTX grew, given that it was a fraudulent operation, and also a sense of betrayal. The fact that Sam himself represented the industry in Washington and in Hollywood and was seen giving testimony in Congress about the benefits of regulation as well. He's, I think, the Bernie Madoff of crypto in that respect, where he was someone who held these positions of influence and power and was embedded in political and policy discourse in a very deep way. And so this is different to some of the other famous exchange failures that we've seen. And a lot of people have been comparing it to Mt. Gox. And there have been other events such as Terra Luna and 3AC, but this one has hit the community differently because of that sense of betrayal. And I suppose the fact that there were a lot of retail investors that had been exposed who were not necessarily, just crypto OGs or people who were kind of deep into smart contracts and that sort of thing. So I think that's kind of adding to people's anger and confusion and wanting to understand, how did this possibly happen and what kind of faith can they have in the industry going forward?
So that chat that you and I had on Blockchain News, we covered regulators and we covered crypto exchanges, and Singapore made it really very clear that they were supportive of blockchain technology, distributed ledger technology, could see great use cases for things like payments, but were, I guess, against crypto exchanges and speculation and trading of cryptocurrencies. I'm assuming pretty much every other government's probably going to be taking the same mindset as the Singaporean government. How does the industry kind of come back from this? And how do we educate regulators on the difference between a centralized exchange and decentralization, which is really what this technology is all about?
That's a really important point. And I think one of the things that has been driving so much fear in the community in the last week is that regulators and policymakers are not sufficiently educated about what is the difference between what they call CeFi and DeFi. And a lot of the regulation that has been worked on around the world so far, like the MiCA policy in the EU, for example, it has been focused on CeFi, the centralized entities in the space. And so the concern is that all of crypto gets lumped under one label, and then everybody gets punished, even if those risks are not relevant across every product or service, out of a feeling of pressure and a sense of urgency that we could throw the baby out with the bathwater, essentially. And so coming back to the example of MiCA, that has already passed Parliament in the EU, but we know that European policymakers are continuing to look at issues in the industry. MiCA is not where policy development ends. And so we can expect that there will be more scrutiny applied to whether there needs to be more regulations or changes to regulations in response to this. I think that we're certainly going to see a reaction out of the US and other jurisdictions as well. But different jurisdictions are at very different points of their policy journey. Some have done very little work and some have already released regulations and guidance. And so I think that it's going to be really important for the industry to cooperate and to go through that education process with policymakers to show them that the technology can actually be leveraged as part of the solution, and that also not all crypto is equal. There are areas of crypto that we know face risks of the kind of failure that we saw with FTX because of the opacity of centralized entities. And so in the case of something like a DeFi exchange, a decentralized exchange, those have all been operating very well throughout this crisis. There's not, it's not the same to have a bank run on a centralized exchange as you would have on of something like Uniswap. It's incredibly different in nature. And the unfortunate challenge that the industry will face is in getting policymakers and regulators who are not informed to sit and spend the time with them and to actually learn and listen to all of this nuance at a time where they may want a quick result and may be tempted to come down with a sledge rather than a chisel. So it's, I think, one of the primary concerns that's been driving a lot of fear at a grassroots level. I've gotten some feedback from builders, founders who have, small projects and small startups, may have only done 1 or 2 rounds of fundraising, and they're very scared. And some of them have also suffered their own losses as well. So they're trying to figure out how to manage runway and treasury, and also worried about whether they'll be able to continue operations if there is a severe regulatory backlash. So, this is palpable at the moment. And there's a lot of discussion going on in the industry about asking that question of how do we educate policymakers appropriately? And in my experience, Dexter, this is something that the industry has struggled to do all through its life. And in the US, we've seen there's been a lot more investment into educating policymakers in recent years, but unfortunately, Sam himself was responsible for a lot of that. And so, this really does pose a massive challenge to the sector.
There's some wild conspiracy theories going around about FBI, CIA, planted to bring down the industry. My kind of thoughts on that is that the governments can't even organize paying bills on time, so I can't understand how they can pull off such complex things like this. But what do you kind of think is has been the trigger for this? Because it's not just what's happened at FTX. You mentioned there, 3AC. We had Luna as well. There's been a lot of questions asked around VC and their involvement as well. Where do you think the kind of, not the blame, but the catalyst lies for, what I would say is a kind of, on a par when I look at the actual events, is the GFC. It's obviously not on a par for the impact that it had. That was global. But I think within the community and the ecosystem of crypto, I think it's every bit as damaging as what the GFC was.
In the context of crypto, I think that's a very fair comparison. I got together with a group of friends over the weekend to watch The Big Short again, which was one of my favorite movies of all time.
Yeah.
My first job.
That's what I've said to people. What happened at FTX? Watch The Big Short. Watch Margin Call.
Oh, there are so many good lines in the movie, and they're so relevant to this week's events. The first job I had in my career was as a receiver in the global financial crisis, working on a liquidation of a company that had failed at that time. And it really was a formative experience for me. It left quite an impression, seeing the impact on everyday people, and week by week watching one disaster after another, from Bear to Lehman, and, the economy has really never been the same. The scale of losses that occurred in the GFC are orders of magnitude greater in terms of absolute numbers of money lost and jobs lost and things like that. The crypto industry is a very small part of the financial market, and the blockchain industry spans other industries other than finance. So in terms of what the mainstream financial community or population would be thinking about the FTX collapse, it feels like Armageddon to people who are inside the industry. But the reaction from outsiders has been, oh, okay, another exchange has failed. And I think, again, coming back to those cultural factors and the sense of betrayal and the cultural impact that Sam and FTX had on the industry, they may not fully appreciate what this feels like to people on the inside. So, perhaps some small comfort for people in the community is we know this is a really big deal for us, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people looking on are saying this is the end of crypto or this is the end of the industry. And some people have rightfully pointed out that as stunning as Madoff was, that wasn't the end of asset management or investing. So neither will the FTX tragedy be the end of crypto or be the end of trading or exchanges, but it certainly is a setback. I think we can't deny that it's going to be a long, hard road to rebuilding. And what we need to do is understand how we can educate people about risk and how we can elevate, I think, more risk appropriate ways of running businesses and investing. It's very hard because you can't give people advice easily about this issue as an expert. If you're an expert, it's probably because you are licensed as a financial advisor, or you have director's duties, or you are a government official, for example. And those people can't freely speak publicly about a lot of the risks in this space. For me personally, like, I often look at an asset like FTT and go, well, why the hell would anybody want to invest in that? But I can't publicly be tweeting or saying things on LinkedIn along those lines. I can now because it's gone to zero, but I can't say that at the time because, I've been in government for a decade, or it may make me it may give people the impression that I'm biased or something like that. So, I see a lot of people making terrible decisions, but the only way I can really advise anyone is if a private institution comes to me for consulting services, and then I can tell them behind closed doors, but I can't publicly say a lot of these things. And I think there's a lot of people in the industry who do have expertise, but their hands are tied the same as mine would be. And so, how do you solve that problem? That's going to take a lot of time. I think in the US, the authorities there have said they want to do more proactive education. And they're not the only jurisdiction who's looking at that. The way this is being discussed in Australia is Blockchain Australia. In the Senate inquiry, I worked with Blockchain Australia and some industry leaders to put together a recommendation for the Senate that the AFSL regime should be reviewed in the context of crypto. Unfortunately, that was one of the few recommendations that Blockchain Australia made that actually was not accepted by the Senate committee. And so there's a gap in Australia and a gap in virtually every jurisdiction on this issue, and there's no clear solution at the moment. I don't know if perhaps the government would be more inclined to revisit that policy recommendation now. We've got a Labor government now, and it was a Liberal senator who led that inquiry. So, they may be more inclined to want to revisit some of their approach now. But, at this point in time, I think it's very tricky because people have turned to social media and influencers who don't necessarily disclose their financial conflicts of interest or their bias or may not be qualified.
I'd also question on them as well, Chloe. Like, where does their information and research come from? Because I know that they're not speaking to any of the people in my network, right, who are like experts and who are speaking to regulators, lawyers, right? They're speaking to the people that are actually building this stuff, right? And I think this is one of the issues is, people are self-proclaimed educators who are nothing more than just, shilling tokens and, it's it. And I think like that's one side to it. And then I think the other side that we've got is, and it's always been a challenge, I think is, well, what actually are these things, right? From an investment perspective, if I'm buying tokens, do I have shares in this project? Or are they just something that has really no value that is sold on a secondary market to the greater fool theory? And I think this is kind of where, the regulators and the industry have to get together. And if, you look at a lot of the stuff that's happened over the last 12, 18 months, and literally with airdrops and, it's created just pump and dump schemes for VC to get a very quick exit using retail as the exit liquidity. If this was any other business, these people would be in jail. And I think this is kind of where, the kind of challenges that we've now got are, how do we get back to the original promise of what this was about, which was actually in response to The Big Short in response of all that behavior. And it's kind of, we created this mini construct of that whole thing all over again. How do you think we kind of get back to, like, what is the essence of what we're doing? What is the purpose of it? And how do we ensure that people are actually living by that mission, which I think was to create a fairer world, right, for everybody. And what we're talking about, none of it seems fair.
It really doesn't seem fair at all. When we were at the Singapore FinTech Festival last week.
It wasn't last week. It was about a year ago. I'm sure.
It was about a year ago. One of the comments that I made on the panel about institutional investing is that we need to have better valuation models in the industry. And I think some leadership on this may end up coming from institutions, because when you look at the data and the surveys on institutions that haven't yet allocated to crypto, one of the top reasons that they cite as to why they're not investing in crypto is because of the lack of valuation models. And so, we as people who understand the industry deeply would know that a Bitcoin is not the same as an Ethereum, which is not the same as a Dogecoin, which is not the same as a stable coin. But if you don't understand the nuance of how these tokens are constructed, what their mechanics are, what are the buy and sell pressures on them, where do they come from, and what are they used for? Do they represent equity? Do they represent something else? That's something that does require expertise. And on the outside, again, the impression is, well, if it's mostly Bitcoin and Ethereum and it's, some kind of weird pseudo equity or weird, funny internet money, it all must be garbage. If it was a real asset, it would be a traditional asset. And so, of course, that's a terribly missed opportunity for someone who's going to write off the entire crypto space. But unless institutions are incentivized to work on those valuation models that build all of that nuance in, I don't know who is going to be incentivized to do it. And so, as you said, what that leaves us with is a space where unqualified and biased and conflicted influencers are unfortunately lining their own pockets with retail money. And you've also mentioned, Dexter, the sort of exit liquidity scam, where people basically build tokens just to dump them on retail, again, lining their own pockets and not necessarily building things of value. So, these are massive risks for people. And then when on top of that, they go and trust their assets with an unregulated or unlicensed firm, or a firm that is poorly regulated. I've gone and reviewed the legislation in the Bahamas that applied to FTX International and where all of this was going on. And FTX and Alameda have been based out of the Bahamas since last year. It was super thin. And you can go and see on the Bahamas Securities Commission website, there's, a handful of pages of regulation that applied to FTX. And there was nothing in there about, them being required to have a board or, there's no real stipulations around wallets or on-chain supervision or custody of assets, prudential, capital, collateral, a lot of these governance and crypto native issues as well that are just ignored. The legislation essentially just says you've got to submit a business plan that has some financial forecasts. You've got to, appoint a compliance person, register with us, and then, send us your financial statements. Well, FTX was audited and the auditors missed the fraud that was going on. So this kind of gives us a bit of an indication about where the gaps are in the regulatory discussion. But I think that, if you look at this supply chain of risks that is posed to a consumer from token issuance through to distribution, through to custody, those are so many different pitfalls that anyone could fall into at any time. So it really is quite risky.
Right. So look, I want to kind of try and look at the future now and take some positives from this. One of the big positives for me is that Bitcoin has just kept on doing what Bitcoin does throughout this whole period. And let's not talk about how it's pegged against the US dollar. Let's just talk about the fact that, as a system, it's kind of I don't want to say faultless, but it's pretty impressive how it's just kept on doing what it does.
Every disaster that the industry has faced and is facing now makes Bitcoin look better and better. People call it the adult in the room of crypto. It does what it says on the box. It's reliable, and it's something that if you really look and see how brilliant it is in terms of its design and its simplicity and what it does, its transparency as well, the fact that it is truly decentralized, it really provides a really solid foundation for then understanding what are the trade-offs that other projects have made in designing their tokens and what the purpose of their tokens are that are different. So I agree with you, Dexter. I think, Bitcoin is, people say honey badger don't care. Bitcoin just keeps producing those blocks every 10 minutes.
Yeah. I think one of the other things that we're going to see, and I've seen this kind of post GFC, whilst unfortunately people did lose their jobs, there was also a lot of job creation, particularly around risk, compliance, and the putting in, I guess, the measures and the processes and the systems and the technology to make sure that this didn't happen again, as well as the education piece. We've talked a lot about the issues around exchanges acting as custodians, and I can't help but think that now this is an opportunity for banks to to start to provide the off ramps and the on ramps, which I think has been one of the biggest issues that we've had for adoption. We've been guilty as an industry of thinking that CX doesn't matter and user experience doesn't matter. These things are pivotal in order to make this, I guess, to go mainstream. What do you see as being the kind of areas where you think if there are going to be opportunities out of this that we can focus our time and our energy and it's going to be worthwhile?
I think aside from that education piece that we discussed and engaging constructively in policy discourse, I think you're right. Trust has been broken. Confidence is low. And so a bank, for example, if it does have a trusted brand, has an opportunity there to start providing products and services to the market. And also, as we've discussed, some of these properly decentralized and valuable projects and protocols hopefully will be elevated and have a moment to shine. I think that in Australia, there's been some uncertainty for a number of years where the industry has been asking for clarity on how do custody rules apply to crypto. And it's been hard for industry to get that clarity in Australia. So, even if there are banks who see that opportunity, and I know that they do because I talk to them, it is going to be challenging for them to offer custody, again, without that policy framework in place. It's hard to get insurance, it's hard to get banking, it's hard to have, the basic business infrastructure that's required to provide any service in this sector. So we do need to ultimately make sure that we're putting forward, I think, policy proposals proactively, because if we allow the government to do it and then the industry is in a reactive position, that's when I think we end up in that risky world that we talked about where through a sense of urgency, government ends up, I think, regulating in a way that that actually doesn't get that balance right.
Yeah, we've seen that with the Royal Commission, right, where they've made it now almost impossible for anybody to provide affordable financial advice to the very people that need it, right? It's kind of crazy. One of the things that I wanted to chat with you about as well, which I think has been the thing that probably disturbed me the most and upset me the most, has been the reaction of the kind of crypto bro culture within this industry, which when you read and you hear and you see some of the things that have gone down in this last week, you kind of ask yourself, and really questioning, what am I doing investing time and energy into this space when there seem to be so many people who just have these, misogynistic, and it's almost like dealing with fascists, right? In many respects. What's been your kind of take on the responses that we've seen this last week, and what do you think we need to do to flush this out of the industry?
There's been a real mixed reaction from the community this week, and what I've observed at a grassroots level is a lot of fear-driven behavior and lashing out. I think people feel disempowered at the moment. The man in the industry who purported to represent them in Congress has turned out to be one of the biggest frauds in the history of the sector, if not the biggest. And so that fear and I guess uncertainty about what this means for them has caused them to behave at their worst and quite poorly. And that kind of sexist and anti-Semitic commentary and personal attacks and things that have been going on have been really stressful and upsetting to see. I think on the other hand as well, these times of crisis really show who are the true leaders in the space. And so you look across the industry and what you see is that there are cool heads. There is a lot of determination for people to want to provide a path forward, provide frameworks and mental models for people to consider and provide constructive suggestions about what can be done, what action can be taken. And so I think that there are a lot of good role models around in terms of how can we cooperate, how can we work together, how can we look to the future. I think as we discussed at the start, it's going to take some time for people to go through that grieving cycle of emotions that they need to flush out of their system. But it is really disappointing to see that some people are letting that fear and anger get to them and cause them to act in the worst of ways. We've talked before about there being this sense in the industry that there is a culture of crypto bros. And a lot of this I see as being, connected to internet culture and Twitter culture where people, not even necessarily anons, but just people online, they get behind a keyboard and something about that makes them want to lash out and be so rude. So I think that, the only way to really respond is just to not give any airtime or voice to those people who are destructive to the culture, elevate the voices that are modeling best practice and good values. I think, for myself and how I've reflected on this in the past week, I've tried to be a part of the conversation in a way of saying, reflecting what the community is feeling, but also pointing to what my priorities are in response.
Yeah.
And I've gotten mostly good feedback on that, but also some misunderstanding and anger from, again, some of those people who are acting out of fear. So, you've got to just focus on the people who are constructive. And over time, I think the culture of the industry will change. To be honest, one of the things that I think is going on in the community is that a lot of these grassroots people and some, founders as well who are OGs or OG investors may be feeling that the culture of the space has already changed so much from what they knew and what it used to be to them that they may feel a little bit resentful that it has become so diverse. And that there are now institutions involved and there are now, all these other types of groups involved, and they don't recognize the culture compared to what it used to be. But I think for people working in such a fast moving space, we're going to have to accept that it's going to continue to change a lot. We are going to see things become more boring. We are going to see things become more TradFi. We are going to see more compliance. And that may not sound as fun or exciting as, speculating on crazy meme coins, but that is the direction that is necessitated by growth and maturity of the sector. And so, I think people need to get up to speed with the fact that this is not just a Reddit forum anymore. This is an industry. And people need to decide how they want to operate and be seen in that space. Yeah.
Going back to Singapore, I think when we did the blockchain news segment, I think I joked about there being no hoodies at the conference, 60,000 people there. But you did very much get the sense that there wasn't crypto bros. We didn't have the stands where the money flicker and the Lamborghini there and everybody in the girls in their swimsuits parading around. Very, very different culture, very, very different kind of mindset. And I think that's kind of where the real business is being done. The stuff with substance, right? The actually building the infrastructure. That's where I think the kind of, I got the sense that there were true builders there. Whereas these other events tends to just be, people debating and sharing their opinions on where they think it's going to go and these kind of wild claims. Do you think, and I don't want to name any names, but, Twitter's a great example of where people are just obsessed about posting their hypotheses on, what the economic future is going to look like, and, the world's going to run on Bitcoin, or whether it's going to be worth X in 2025. I think that's been the thing that's really disturbed me, is that despite the crash and people clearly, some people clearly losing everything, you've still got others on there who are trying to pump up the price of tokens that they're invested in. They've got a vested interest. Kind of, where do you think regulation needs to come there? Because my sense is, the people that I speak to within the industry, particularly in Australia, I think, and especially the exchanges, want more regulation. There's one or two where I think I've seen some kind of crazy stuff, like I'll not name who it was, but on my birthday, I get an email saying today's a great day to buy crypto. Right? My birthday, how's that, right? So how do you think we kind of regulate this? What I think is the marketing and the advertising stuff, which financial services, they do a really good job of regulating that, where you have to have, from a product perspective and a marketing perspective and advertising perspective, you can only use certain words. You can't make claims. We've got none of that in the crypto industry. How do you think it's more of a case of that's the thing that needs to be regulated first, and then we can kind of start to focus around some of the more complex stuff?
In my observation, the jurisdictions that have done better on this are jurisdictions that have actually developed crypto industry policy. And I think there's been a resistance to doing that in Australia because there is a huge commitment to this idea of technology neutrality, which says, well, we just need to figure out what's a financial product and not, and what is not. And then we'll know what gets regulated under the Corps Act and what gets regulated under the Consumer Act. However, that leaves a huge amount of uncertainty for all the supply chain of issuers and distributors and infrastructure providers to go, okay, well, that's great. But if you, government, are not going to tell us which falls over the right and left side of the line, then we don't really know what licenses we are eligible for, if we should be applying for them at all, and what does this all look like, and what about the specific features of the industry where you can't really be technology neutral. And custody, again, is sort of an example of that, where you need crypto native regulation. And so I think that, governments are going to have to make some decisions about, actually whether they need to create some bespoke legislation. And I think, to Senator Andrew Bragg's credit, he has proposed this idea of there being an act for the industry. I think sometimes, speaking bluntly, policymakers need to get off their high horse for a second. Yeah. We love in the policy community to talk about these principles and these frameworks and things like that. But enough years have passed now with such little progress on mitigating any of these risks. I think it's time to really start to get a bit action oriented, not in that urgent sense of the sledgehammer, but, really actually starting to be a little bit creative and thinking about what are the policy levers, and what's kind of a sensible, pragmatic way of approaching this. I think there's a little bit of a, ivory towerism going on in some jurisdictions where, people are kind of reluctant to look at creative policy development, or they simply are not informed enough or don't feel informed enough to look at crypto native regulation. So, there have been some crackdowns on influencers, crackdowns on marketing, solicitation, those sorts of things, but it does depend on the jurisdiction. And so, that's kind of the challenge that I would put to policymakers. Yeah.
When you look, because you've got a bit of a global view, which government would you say, or which country do you think is kind of leading the way around policy and regulation of blockchain technology and crypto?
So, I do operate globally. And I think, on this issue of kind of marketing, it's been a big topic of interest in Singapore and in the UK in terms of, having a fully fledged out, framework. I think the EU has undergone a lot of effort to get MiCA passed through Parliament, and it's not a perfect system, but I think it provides a lot more clarity than in a jurisdiction like Australia or the US. I think that there's a lot of work going on in the Middle East. Pretty much every jurisdiction in the Gulf is doing something in this space. In the US, there's been some highlights in a few select states that have kind of specialized in different areas of policy, but there's no comprehensive framework and there's no federal clarity across the supply chain. So, that's kind of the summary overview. Some Asian jurisdictions as well, they had regimes set up a number of years ago. So, everyone's kind of moved at a different speed. I think that it's going to be really important for regulators to cooperate. It's going to be quite a tangled web with all the different policy responses and priorities that different jurisdictions have had. But the priorities, in my view, really need to be looking at these issues of transparency, on-chain governance, custody, and those issues as well around rehypothecation and dealing of capital and collateral as well.
Do you think then perhaps this FTX event could be the catalyst that does bring countries together and regulators together to actually start to really kind of flesh out these issues together rather than in separate jurisdictions? Because I think one of the things that really struck me about FTX is people were impacted globally, but not necessarily in the US because it is domiciled in the Bahamas.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think this is going to increase cooperation between regulators, and regulators are going to have those information sharing agreements. In terms of international global level cooperation, multilateralism in traditional finance has been extended to the crypto asset sector in some select cases. So we see the BIS has done some work on Prudential. We see the IMF has done some work, and there are bodies like the OECD who do take a global view and do some. I think the OECD does quite good work in this space. It's very hard to coordinate globally, but I suppose that whether FTX does help to prioritize this industry, I certainly hope so. But again, we need to make sure that the industry is right there alongside them, making sure that they're feeding into the process. And I think with some of these international bodies, there's been some criticism that they've been accused of only doing tokenistic consultation with industry as sort of a ticker box exercise and not really genuinely taking the time to get skilled up. Australia's invested a lot more in its resources in a public sector sense following the Senate inquiry. And that Senate inquiry process, I think, was quite an important and influential one. But, we do have a new government in Australia now. So we also need to get a better sense from an Australia-specific point of view of, what the government's plans are. The government has continued on with some of the work that was already underway at the time of the election, but we haven't really seen any public communications from the government on how they're going to prioritise that. Previous Treasurer Josh Frydenberg had very clear timelines that he had set out with milestones for different sub-priorities. And so it would be great if we could see something like that come from the now Labor government so that the industry could get organised and plan. This is a fairly resource-constrained space, despite appearances on social media. And so, it's important to make sure that the industry has that opportunity to feed into whatever happens next.
Yeah. If we kind of take the crypto element out of it and you look at actually the use cases and the utility, I just can't understand how governments aren't putting everything into it, right? When you think about the amount of money that is locked up just in global trade, right? You look at the systems that banks are using. They're still using green screen MS-DOS, right? Computers for trade finance. And you're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars that's locked up every month. It's taken 4 months to kind of get things moving. I just can't understand, right? Like why this is not a priority. And yet, the talk is about, and I guess, look, the question to you is, do you think that the problems are ones that the industry has created itself, right? The kind of perception of, crypto bro culture, the speculative nature of it, is that the kind of innovation piece and the utility has just been lost, right? And it kind of, I see all these comments on LinkedIn, and people who aren't really involved in this space have got strong opinions about how there's no utility. You and I know, right?
Yeah.
We see it, right? Every single day, we see the things that are being built. We see the problems that are being solved, right? On a big scale. There's huge utility there. How do we kind of change the conversation from token price and meme coins to actually solving big world problems?
I will say there are some pockets of government where this potential is recognised. The Australian Border Force has done some really cool stuff on blockchain with international trade. IP Australia has done some great work on traceability. CSIRO has got good talent, and they funded a startup in Australia that was used in the agricultural, horticultural industry, and actually helped to prevent theft, brand theft by Chinese scammers for a Tasmanian farmer. But that's just one anecdote from so many examples across the agricultural sector. The Department of Industry also funded some work in critical minerals. And so, there's plenty of use cases. I think, the things that excite me personally are, looking at the Optus data hack that happened recently. And now there's also Medibank as well.
You're talking to a victim of Medibank here, right? It's
why aren't we using technology like zero knowledge proofs and distributed identity solutions? There are international standards under W3C. There are people building this stuff. At a state level, New South Wales government is doing some really interesting work that they've just announced on this. And we see that in the non-government sector as well. Red Cross has done interesting work. We could talk on and on and on about all these kinds of case studies. And they cut across finance and lots of different industries. So I think that, these stories don't get elevated because they're not as interesting in the sense that, I think people are very attracted to financial use cases. And a lot of the financial use cases are speculative, which makes them exciting. There's an aspect of gambling to them. There's also a lot of humor and meme energy that kind of goes into them. They have, viral cultures that you just don't see in, horticulture. It's really not the same group of people that appeals to. So a lot of the airtime then and how media responds and how, government responds is it kind of follows where the noise is. So, I think we do as an industry need to get better at telling these stories, and tying them to things that are relevant. We need to talk about examples like Optus and Medibank to show people what's the relevance of the technology to their lives. What does it mean for everyday, ordinary people who may not give a crap about Ethereum, but, maybe they do care about their identity being stolen. So, I think that it is a challenge and something that it comes down to groups like Blockchain Australia. It comes down to community self-organized groups as well that have been popping up in the last 12 months. I think that, the way that we put together events and media and things like that, it's something that we can be mindful of going forward.
And look, I think I talked about this when we were in Singapore before all of this happened. And it was like, yourself, Brady, and like people just not getting a voice and not getting a platform. And you got morons who are just taking up all the oxygen in the room. And they are morons because we've seen the stuff that they do, right? Like, and what it results in. And I think now is the time, right? That I agree with you. It has to be people like yourself, people that are building things, people that are solving real problems that the world has, right? And I think the quicker that we can move on from what's happened at FTX, the quicker we can kind of try and get some semblance of order around this kind of highly speculative kind of bubbles that keep getting created, and actually somehow figure out a way, how do we actually fund these businesses that are actually solving real problems? Do you think the amount of money that's gone into tokens, right, and how that could have been utilized by these businesses and the problems that could be solved? And I kind of feel deep level of shame that I've been involved in some of this speculative nature, right? When we could have been, I could have been putting the money to actually investing in companies. And I think that's one of the other issues is that, how do these companies get a platform and how do they get access to funding, and how does the public, people that are interested in this stuff and passionate about it get involved as well? And I think that's kind of, the thing that I'm hoping we see come out of this is there are some really good, cool things that I think have come from the model we've seen from a crowdfunding perspective, the power of this. I mean, it's phenomenal, right? But imagine if we put that to use around technology that's solving, potential supply chain issues around grain, right? Rather than a meme coin of a dog. It's, there's so much power in this space and opportunity that's just going to waste right now.
I think that, it in terms of looking at the bright side of this, right? VCs are still investing. Founders are still building. Institutions have a very long-term perspective on their plans in this space. I think there'll be a lot of lessons that will be learned coming out of what has happened here. It is going to take some time for the dust to settle, but for people who are really committed to the space and really get it, I think these experiences, they do give people perspective. And so this is a time to think clearly, and hopefully we'll all come out of it strong.
Well, Chloe, thanks for joining me on this very first episode of Blockchain Chatter. You've been an awesome guest as always. Where can people find out more about Genesis Block?
I'm across LinkedIn and Twitter. My Twitter handle is at Chloe White Oz. Oz is AUS. Feel free to reach out. I've got a website, genesisblock.com.au, where you can also submit a request or send a note to me or something like that.
Cool.
So, it's been a difficult week, Dexter, but it's always good to see you. And I hope that the next time that we meet, it will be in happier circumstances.
Yeah, me too. And you can connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks for joining us. Make sure to give us a like and subscribe. And if you prefer listening, you can check out the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Until the next episode, stay safe. Blockchain Chatter is brought to you by Tier 1 People, leaders in fintech executive search. You can reach us at tier1people.com.